In 2014, a US Marine named Joseph Scott Pemberton, stationed in the Philippines, murdered trans woman Jennifer Laude. He invoked the so-called trans panic defense, and his charge was reduced from murder to the lesser charge of homicide. His prosecution and conviction sparked a diplomatic standoff between the Philippines and their former colonial ruler. The US sheltered Pemberton in an armed forces custodial center until he was eventually pardoned by the far-right president of the Philippines, Rodrigo Duterte, in 2020. This is nothing new. In the British Raj in India of the 1850s, a moral panic about hijras raged through the colonial ruling classes. Administrators worried that this group of gender non-conforming feminine people would seduce and corrupt their officers with the temptation of sodomy. Men who committed violence against hijras were excused on the basis that they suffered from a kind of temporary madness on discovering a hijra's, quote, male body. According to a recent book by historian Jules Gill-Peterson, the history of trans misogyny stretches far back to before the modern category of trans womanhood evolved, and it impacted far more people than we might at first think. If we look again at stories of both trans misogyny and trans femininity, we get a greater insight into how gender works, and how gendered violence helps underwrite systems of racial, class, and colonial domination. Jules Gill-Peterson is an Associate Professor of History at Johns Hopkins University and a General Editor of Transgender Studies Quarterly. Jules is the co-host of Outward, Slate's LGBT podcast, and she's also a member of the Death Panel podcast about healthcare and political economy. She's the author of Histories of the Transgender Child, published in 2018, and most recently, A Short History of Trans Misogyny, published by Verso Books. She argues for a break with some now common sense stories of queer history, arguing instead that we shouldn't strictly separate sex and gender, that we should take trans histories of sex work seriously, and that claiming the future means reclaiming femininity. We talked about drag queens and street queens, about dressing up, stealing wallets, and punching policemen. So I'm joined by the wonderful Jules Gill-Peterson. Jules, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me, Eleanor.
Can you tell us, just first of all, when do these phrases, trans misogyny and transgender in general, come into common uses? Because obviously, with a historical lens, we know that these aren't trans-historical, if I can accidentally use upon their phrases that by which people use to describe themselves, understand themselves. So when do these come into usage?
Actually, trans words in general to describe like trans people or transitions have been around a pretty long time, but like transgender itself, or just trans the way we would talk about it today, it really rose to prominence in the 1990s. The actual word has a longer history that goes back to the 70s, but that's sort of nerdy stuff for another day. And so, this sort of sense of transgender as, moving away from gender assigned at birth, or transition as in transitioning socially or medically, that's sort of a 90s thing in the way we talk about it today, right? In this sort of contemporary formation, connoting the things that I think come to all of our mind. Trans misogyny kind of grows up alongside that, right? There is a great efflorescence of trans as an adjective going in front of all sorts of words, some which have succeeded and become part of our everyday language, many which have disappeared, and that's probably fine. But trans misogyny, I think, is one of the good ones. It's sort of just a word that's kind of been bandied about, particularly by trans women, to try and name something specific in their experience. But definitely the writer and feminist Julia Serrano, I think, is really well known in her book Whipping Girl for kind of elaborating the concept for the first time and trying to think about what's characteristic about the kind of misogyny that trans women specifically face, right? It's sort of particular understanding of oppositional sexism, a ranking of men and women, but also its components that might be different from the kind of misogyny that other women face. So that's sort of maybe the inheritance I'm taking up in this book myself.
I want to go into the specific characteristics and I guess the structure of trans misogyny just in a bit. But first up, I would love to know why you chose to write a history of trans misogyny as opposed to a history of trans women or trans womanhood.
Right. I know, right? It's like, what, Jules, do you just hate yourself? You just want to write about the most depressing subject? Like, look, I'll be real with people. I started working on this book in that very special year, like 2021, where a lot of people in middle-class professions like myself were working from home and just kind of like have way too much time on my hands because of the way COVID changed our working conditions, and was just receiving a lot of online harassment, but also had kind of hit a point in my career where I was really experiencing forms of trans misogyny. And I was like, as a lot of my work, it started as out of irritation, being like, I'm really frustrated by this, but frankly, I don't think I'm the main character of history. That's one thing my day job has taught me. And so I became curious, like, what can I think about, that kind of gets way beyond my own personal experience here. But, as for like, why would I want to write about the structure of violence, right, that attends trans women or trans femininity in the world, instead of just writing, a kind of affirmative history of trans women? Well, part of it is this is going to be really nerdy, but I think it's important. I mean, could you write a history of women? No, I mean, like, the women is too vast of a category, right? And I don't just mean there are so many different kinds of women. I mean, it's an abstraction, right? I mean, what is women, right? I mean, women are so many different kinds of people, thank goodness. It would be really boring if woman was one thing. And so trans women, function the same way. Obviously, there is no uniform account of trans women. Trans women, kind of appear distributed throughout the population kind of at random. And so there are rich trans women, there are poor trans women, there are white trans women, there are brown and black trans women, and then there are cultural questions, the historical questions that are fascinating, right? Is the modern kind of trans womanhood that, that we see represented in the UK today or in the United States, how long has that even been around, right? These are questions that I think are fascinating, if handled poorly, very uncomfortable, right? But because of that, I was sort of like, great, like there's like almost like 60 years of feminist history that definitely doesn't take women's existence for granted, but asks questions about how what it means to be a woman or how women's lives are structured has changed over time in different locations contextually. And I wanted to do the same for trans women. And so to do that, though, I really did need to ask, like, okay, what are the kinds of forces that created the conditions for the kinds of trans womanhoods that we see today? And actually, unfortunately, I think one of the real answers empirically is that trans misogyny had this kind of constitutive force, not in creating trans women, but actually in creating the dominant material living conditions in which modern trans womanhood has come to exist. But what's really interesting about trans misogyny is because it's an impersonal structure or a power system, it actually affects people who aren't trans women. And so one of the things it allowed me to do as a historian is write about the emergence of modern trans womanhood without worrying like that I have to figure out who is in and who is out, because the structure of power is so leaky, it attracts and it fastens itself to so many other kinds of people that you can actually make those differences really clear. And so it actually relieved the kind of pressure, I think, of identity politics to be like, I've got to figure out what a trans woman is. That's not something I'm interested in figuring out. I mean, you can't answer that question, right? And so trans misogyny, actually, weirdly enough, right? It's like, if you can stomach it, it gives you a much more nimble lens through which to survey the past and actually understand some of the causes of the world that we live in today without kind of doing that purity politics of trying to decide, okay, like you could imagine a version of this thinking that would be like, trans misogyny only affects trans women. So if we use it, it will tell us, will reveal who's really a trans woman and who isn't, right? That would be a very like internet version, right? A affected, exempt kind of binary, right? Sorry, history doesn't agree. But what I like is that I don't have to worry about that anymore. I could talk about like, here are trans women, right? But here are other groups of people who I, in the book, call people who have been trans feminized, who have been treated through trans misogyny, but they're in fact not trans women. And I think we should know that. I think that's important politically, but also just like factually. I'm such a boring historian at the end of the day. I like just want to know what is most likely true. And for me, trans misogyny instead of a history of trans women was actually kind of an empirical decision.
Let's get into that structure of trans misogyny and trans feminization and how they kind of wrap together in this gendering process that we're pointing at. You locate one of the starts of trans misogyny, trans feminization. Of course, it's a much longer history. How much time do you have? How many books can anyone write in one lifetime, right?
But don't tempt me.
I will tempt you as much as I like, which is always infinitely. But one of the places in history that you land on is the British Raj and the treatment of hijras. Can you tell us about that and how it gives us a sense of what trans misogyny is and what trans misogyny does? Because those questions are always sort of bound together in my mind. What is it and what does it do?
Yeah, that's a fabulous way of putting it. And I'll say, obviously, I'm a U.S. historian, so the history of British Empire is not my primary area of subject expertise. However, my family is from India, from North India, the not too far from the region I'm discussing in the book. And I am very literally, as we were discussing before we started recording, a product of the British Empire, a fact recorded ingloriously in the Gill in my name, like so many other diasporic people from the Punjab region of India. So I've always been interested in subcontinental colonial histories, and particularly the histories of hijras, which are, a very long-standing category of ascetic type of person that has, been around for arguably hundreds, if not thousands of years, but about whom we know very little because of a lack of good research and also the kind of history of Orientalism and, frankly, white European travelogues sort of, creating a story about these people that they wanted to, but a group of people, who at the onset of British colonialism in India, were one of many kinds of ascetic, spiritually sanctioned groups of people that occupied an important role in different parts of the subcontinent. So hijras, were people that, by a Western standard would be sort of, assigned male at birth, but who lived often from a young age as girls and women's, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes would undergo like an orchiectomy surgery as part of that. But in any case, they had like a really specific role in the 19th century, actually supporting the reproduction of the heterosexual household. And so sort of the ascribed infertility of hijras, that they couldn't, reproduce, couldn't have children, though they were women or feminine, right? That made them understood to be really important to, in fact, blessing fertility in marriages and births. And so hijras were around, would often, be hired to perform, maybe sing and dance, like at a wedding or at the birth of a child. Also, were permitted to ask for alms in public in a way that had a kind of religious backing to it that interestingly crosses like both Hindu and Muslim traditions. Anyways, all of that is background. These people are not trans women, right? Absolutely not. Come from a very different, long history that had nothing to do necessarily with Britain until the East India Company shows up, and actually in the aftermath of the 1857 rebellion against British rule, when the crown really consolidates, into the Raj, we get that Empress of India and all that good stuff. It's in that context that there's a lot of anxiety, in the British administrative colonial class over how to consolidate power in India, right? And one of the big problems they face is they obviously just do not understand the people who live in India. There's so many cultures, so many languages, so many religions. They just don't know who these people are. But hijras really emerge as this kind of panic for British power. And I was reading a book by a historian, Jessica Hinchy, this fabulous, really thorough history of this moral panic around hijras that happens, beginning in the 1850s, but kind of reaches a peak in the 1870s with the passage of a specific law targeting hijras, actually for like genocidal eradication, which is not something that British policy frequently pursued in India, like really just this extreme moral opprobrium directed at this group of people whose very existence was seen to kind of basically transgress every British norm, right? Like, this is the 19th century. It's the era when ideally women are in the home, men are in public working. Obviously, that's not how the working classes live, but that's the ideology. Hijras both transgress that because they're women in public, but the British are also like, oh my God, they transgress everything. The British see them as men dressed as women and actually basically accuse them of being sex workers and of seducing normal men, so to speak, into sodomy, just by virtue of being seductively dressed in women's clothing, dancing, etc. Right? And so the British, undertake this entire campaign to try and bring about the elimination of this group of people by policing them aggressively, creating a registry of who they are, like police intelligence work, right? 19th century style, criminalizing their clothing, criminalizing begging in public, criminalizing singing and dancing in public, so destroying their way of life, right? Making it illegal to pass down property and have their households and discipleships, just like full court press, right? At a certain point, they also ask police officers to literally enforce the law. And you see all these accounts I was reading in this book by Hinchy of police officers going out into public, finding hijras, stopping them, right? Accosting them, cutting their hair, ripping off their jewelry, forcing them out of women's clothing and into men's clothing.
Wow.
And when I was reading this, I was like, wait a minute, what? Like, that's like what police famously do to trans women, like since the late 19th century. A few decades later, I was like, oh, I've seen the police reports. I've read the first person accounts. I've seen that trajectory into the 20th century in many different locations in the world of the police having this role and of men stopping trans women in the street and forcibly attacking their bodies and basically defeminizing them dramatically, violently, sometimes with sexual violence. And I was like, this is really interesting because this is happening several decades before the first time I see evidence of that happening to trans women. And these people aren't trans women. And so all of a sudden, my brain was like, wait a minute. This is transmisogynistic, but it's happening first. Like, actually, it happened first to a group of people who are not trans women. Whoa, like I was not expecting that, right? And I was like, well, what does that mean, right? Like, what does it mean if colonial governance, right, and the anxiety over producing a kind of colonial sovereignty affixed to certain small populations seen to represent disorder, right? And so getting rid of them would consolidate British moral order, ergo British sovereignty in India, in part by imposing a British sex and gender system and labor system, right? You're helping consolidate colonial power. Well, what does it mean if that's actually the origin of this very characteristic kind of transmisogyny, which is street-level violence, where the mere presence of someone whose femininity is read as trans is constituted as such a dangerous threat, especially to men or to the state, that it's okay to put it down with extreme violence. And actually, that violence should probably be public, should probably be humiliating, and should serve as a lesson to everyone else in that group. And it was just like this incredible moment, not like literally, it was an incredible moment intellectually, where I was like, well, if that's true, then it actually does suggest that the kind of trans panic, right, that we talk about today in terms of, like, say, someone getting acquitted for attacking or killing a trans woman at trial, the kind of trans panic alibi and trans misogynistic violence was invented first by colonial authorities, because I saw the same pattern happening in North America with U.S. and Canadian federal agents on Indian reservations, native reservations. And I saw similar patterns in other colonial contexts. So I was like, wow, this feels like a big deal, right? If this kind of racialized gender violence emerged first to consolidate colonial power more broadly, that has huge implications for how we understand not just where it comes from, but like what its purpose is, what its scope is, who it affects, and what doing politics would be in response, right? And so to me, it was just like that classic thing where, as a historian, I came across something I didn't expect it. It really challenged how I thought. And I was like, oh gosh, I've got to write a whole book about this. So that's the behind the scenes look too.
Yeah, you write this quote, which I love, which is, the dolls hold all the receipts and the time has come to call them in. love to hear more about how you think of trans misogyny and trans feminization as a lens onto these broader regimes of gender and gendered violence as structuring principles that affect, well, everyone.
Yeah. I mean, the dolls hold all the receipts was definitely one of these, like almost like a mantra or a slogan that came to me early on in conceiving of this project and some of the first draft materials where I was like, look, exactly, I'm not writing a history of all trans women. Because to be honest, I'm a trans woman of color. Although I live a very boring middle class life today, I came from a very difficult working class background. My allegiances politically and personally lie with poor trans women and trans women of color. A class of trans women who historically have served a very pivotal but severely devalued and degraded role in certainly US and British society. That's trans women as the originators of high glamour, beauty beyond compare, but also like a specific role in the informal economy as sex workers, nightlife entertainers, as service economy workers. Trans women have, for at least about 120, 150 years, kind of played this role where they provide comfort, they provide sex, they provide companionship, they provide all these things to men, and they provide templates of beauty and, lustrous, kind of just like the height, the most of all femininity, as a template for the fashion industry and for tastemakers into music. And they actually provide templates for all women's femininity, but they've been highly devalued for all of that, all of this time, right? This is a class of people who have been forced to live basically on the bottom rung of the social hierarchy and the economic hierarchy, but actually play an incredibly influential role in society because they're embedded with people in the highest positions of powers. Cannot tell you how many, and I'm speaking as a historian here. This is gossip, but it's also true, right? It's historical gossip. Cannot tell you how many in America, how many senators and politicians in Washington, D.C., as far back as the 30s and the 40s, had their girls that they went out with on the town. Like these women have been in the halls of power, but they haven't had any power, right? Definitely a history of that, in Westminster as well. Could definitely speak to that from things I've read. So it's like there's this group of women who are trans women who are actually like really influential, but are treated as the lowest of the low. And so by saying that the dolls hold all the receipts, part of what I want to say is like this trans women have been construed, I think, like in the liberal imaginary as like a suffering population who experience too much violence, who are deprived of everything, and who we should care about because they're mistreated, right? And I want to say like, yes, they are mistreated. Yes, they have been deprived of a lot, but that doesn't mean they're not powerful. And actually, we shouldn't only care about them if they're martyrs for whatever cause we have. We should be interested in what they know because of their unique vantage point in the social order. And so that's sort of what I wanted to do. I was like, I want to write a history. Trans misogyny actually allows me to write a history that prioritizes poor trans women, trans people of color, and people who don't even identify as trans women, but have played pivotal roles in the most devalued sectors of the social world and the economy, like the sex work sector. And I just wanted to take that seriously, make that front and center, and see what would happen. How do you narrate history from that premise? And to me, that's about calling in some of those receipts, because it's just a thing I have observed in the world, especially with other trans women. It's like, oh, the things we know. Oh, if we all said what we knew all at once, the world would stop, right? Yeah. And, everybody's so lucky that trans women haven't called all that in at once, right? But there actually is an interesting, I think, political question in there about like, how do you let people who have actually a really sophisticated vantage point on what is unequal and bad in the world we live in, how do you let them lead, right? And how do you not either patronize them, infantilize them, or alternatively romanticize them, right? How do you actually take seriously the things that they have earned, through very difficult experiences? And so to me, that's sort of like both the passion behind this book, but also the methodology.
Let's talk a little bit more about the history that you write about of the trans panic alibi, trans panic defense, differently written. It seems to play a role as almost a bit of a synecdoche for the relationship between state violence on the one hand and interpersonal violence on the other. I mean, we tend to focus sometimes on the panic bit as a kind of psychological diagnosis of what's going on. But of course, the defense bit is equally vital, right? It operates in a state context, in a legal context, and crucially in one of your examples in a military context. Can you tell us about why that particularity, that particular manifestation of transmisogyny is kind of vital to understanding what's going on here, the structure of transmisogyny?
Absolutely, right? I think, part of the context here is just we actually have been told over and over again by the media to pay attention to violence against trans women, regardless of your politics, right? Everybody knows there are trans women, and especially if they're poor, and especially if they're Black and brown, that they experience really elevated, perhaps some of the highest rates of violence in US and UK society of any one particular group, right? And we have just tons of macabre, frankly, I think sort of irresponsible descriptions of that violence. There's a whole kind of cottage industry around it, even by very well-meaning people. But one question I realized we have no answer to is, why does this violence happen? Why? Not how, not where, not when, not under what circumstances. Why? What is the root cause of the violence? If we want to stop it, we need to know what causes it. And the only explanations we've had so far are the thinnest ones possible. Criminal explanations, which are pretty embarrassing, in part because it's like you can't even secure convictions against people who commit violence against trans women because they can use a trans panic defense. They can say at trial, actually, when I found out this person was trans when she was a trans woman, which is often, frankly, a lie. They just make that up, that they discovered it at one moment. I was so overwhelmed. I basically experienced a form of what, criminal law would call a kind of insanity, right? And so I'm actually absolved of responsibility. So it's like, okay, well, that's no good. But also, I don't believe that locking people up is justice. So what is the cause of this violence? Well, psychologists have tried to explain it, and so have feminists. And frankly, the answer is pretty disturbing, right? Basically, it's like, well, men are just inherently violent, right? Men are homophobic. Men don't want to see a penis, right? And if they see one, they'll kill the person who has it. It's like, I'm sorry, are we actually saying men are that brutish? Because I think that's a horrific thing to say about men. And I also don't think it's true, right? Most men don't kill trans women. Lots of men date trans women and love them and care about them. So it's just obviously not true. Psychology just gives us these really weird theories of human behavior that are just obviously not universal, obviously not culturally competent, right? And also I don't think lead to good political prescriptions. So I was like, what is the cause? Where does this come from? And again, that's what I first started to suspect looking at, the history of colonial India was I actually think this form of violence was not invented by individual men. I think it was invented by the state. And actually, it's the police officer that became the bridge here. And so my claim is actually, again, it's evidentiary. It's just empirical. I think the cause of violence against trans women in this trans panic context was invented by government, by states first, and then the state deliberately deputized a certain class of men to kind of carry out that state violence, right? So literally in colonial India, the police officer, it's his job, right? But think about it. This guy is going out into public, stopping these hijras, defeminizing them, beating them in public. People see that. People are being given instructions on how to treat this group of people, right? In the United States, federal Indian agents are entering reservations, targeting Two-Spirit, different kinds of, specific Two-Spirit people doing the same thing in public. They're teaching a lesson, right? This is how you treat this class of people. And actually, the military is the other main one in the 19th century. You see in all sorts of colonial overseas colonies as well. Red light districts obviously form. Military sex work and sex economy is very important to all empires. And you start to see, there are sexologists like Magnus Hirschfeld, the guy who, opened this Institute for Sexual Research in Berlin, the one who's often, given all this heroism around being one of the first trans clinics. This guy loved taking trips around the world, and he would, write kind of travelogues about them. And according to him, everywhere he went, it's could you believe it? Every city in the whole colonial world, right, all European and American colonies, they all have these red light districts, and there's always these trans feminine sex workers who are there for the men stationed in these colonial military outposts. And those men also, like, they are acting out a colonial relationship, right? They are literally the occupying force. And so there is a way that sort of the personal recapitulates, right, this political relationship of coloniality. And these men come to treat, those sex working trans women as particularly disposable. And that's something that continues all the way into the 21st century. And so one of the contemporary cases that I talk about, it was a young trans woman in the Philippines, Jennifer Laude, whose death at the hands of a U.S. Marine, Joseph Pemberton, was actually international news. It caused a major diplomatic rift between the United States and the Philippines at the time, because a huge swath of people in the Philippines mobilized not just in defense of trans women, right, but actually against U.S. colonialism, because the Philippines was an outright, literal United States colony until the 1940s. And since then, the United States has used the Philippines as sort of a client state to maintain huge military bases in Asia, right? A key to the U.S. sort of Pacific imperial hegemony. And actually, U.S. soldiers and officials had total impunity from being arrested under Philippine law. And this Marine's killing of a trans woman that he had picked up at a bar in a transactional sort of way was the very first time that the Philippine state tried to prosecute an American soldier, right, for committing a crime on Philippine soil. And the United States defended this guy. They literally would not let him go to trial or be incarcerated. They took him and put him on a U.S. military base and protected him for years until the far-right president, Rodrigo Duterte, was elected and pardoned the guy in, 2020. So it's like there's this long unbroken history in which you see a certain class of men who are trained to act on behalf of the state, to enact state policy aggressively, violently, right, towards populations of people, are actually basically the literal bridge. They are individual men acting on behalf of the state. But I think that shows us exactly where historically, where this culture and so-called psychology of trans panic came from. The state had to invent it, deputize a group of functionaries who were, interestingly, men, who unattached men with spending power, the same kinds of men who probably do go to these red light districts. And from there, it kind of, moves through the larger population and becomes a cultural trope. So really, like, if the 1870s is the first time we see these kinds of trans panics, in a colonial context, by the 1890s, you see trans women, say in New York City, talking about how, gosh, men have gotten a lot more violent when I go on dates with them, because now they know what a trans woman looks like. They can clock me, and they're starting to have these trans panic attacks be directed at them. And I just think, again, it's like we look at the chain of custody, the chain of events here. Finally, we can answer that question, why does this happen? It's not because men are evil. It's not because trans women inherently invite reprisal. It's not because we're all like hardwired to be violent people and the only thing keeping us from attacking other people every single day is the social contract. No, it's just like colonialism requires a massive amount of state violence to pull off and designate certain populations as scapegoats, as key to maintaining those fictions of power, and deputizes actual people to carry out the state's will. And over time, that changes cultural norms. And I just think like that's a pretty sad diagnosis, but I actually think politically that's a much better situation than saying men are inherently evil or trans women are inherently invite reprisal, or gender violence or sexual violence is just because we're patriarchal, we have to stop. Yeah, it's like those are really gigantic explanations that kind of make it really hard to know what to do. But if we say like the police are the originator of trans panic, I think we know where to start if we want to stop trans misogynistic violence, right? And I think we know who else is in solidarity with trans women, right? First group of people would just be other sex workers. Oh, so a sex worker politics actually is probably a good politics for trans women, right? Abolitionist politics is probably a good politics for trans women. Anti-colonial politics are probably good politics for trans women, right? What a different starting place than the kind of turf framing of the issue, which is that trans women's rights conflict with other women's rights, and we have to have a battle, right, in the judiciary or in the halls of parliament to figure out who gets to have how much gender.
I'm so glad you raised sex work as like a key historical fulcrum around which a lot of these histories play out. A lot of the discourse plays out, capital D discourse, because it's you have almost something that can be seen almost as a controversial take, right? When you kind of affirm that yes, there is something interesting and crucial about the connection between trans femininity and sex work, because understandably, that a lot of people can be resistant to reaffirming that connection when people who are kind of, should I say, visibly trans or visibly appear trans on the street are policed on the basis of a police assumption that they are sex workers, right? And they may be, they may not be. They suffer violence from that assumption nonetheless. So, what in your eyes do we get when we sort of lean into that and say, yes, actually, there is something really important going on here?
Yeah, I think one, we're being more honest and accurate, which again, I am a historian by day. It's very boring in reality, but I think it's like a huge relief. It demoralizes this. Part of pro-sex work politics is demoralizing sex work. Also demoralizing sex, right? The fiction that when you combine sex and work, something unique and special and morally bad happens is just a terrible lie. It's like, hey, it turns out sex is neither good nor bad. It's a thing that it can be great, it can be boring, it can be bad, right? You know what is pretty bad generally for everyone? Work under capitalism. So guess what? Sex work might really reveal how much we don't like about work. But the only way we're going to get there is if we demoralize it, because making it moral exceptionalizes it and maintains the fiction that there's something uniquely bad about sex work and that sex workers are at best tainted by their own work, as opposed to, we're all alienated and frankly made miserable and worse by having to work, but that's not because we're bad people, right? It's because the system of work is bad. So I think that's important politically, and I'm in solidarity with that. But also, I just genuinely wanted to know. I was like, okay, I am a historian. It's very obvious to me that all but the most wealthy trans women, which is like truly the 1% of trans women, everyone else pretty much has done sex work for at least 150 years, at least at the point where we have the modern, like urban cities at the scale we have them, today, the sort of world of urban modernity in the global north, in which you have like red light districts. And, there are longer histories of sex work, but trans women are just there from day one. And I was like, again, why? Why? If I accept that it's not bad, then I can finally ask the question, why? Why do trans women do sex work? We don't actually know the answer to that. No one has tried to answer it before. The answers are all descriptive. They're like, well, it's a last resort. Yeah. Okay, well, why are trans women almost exclusively in a situation of last resort? Like, what happens that pushes, people towards this? And also, why do some people make wonderful careers out of it, right? And so it actually ended up being a really profound question, not about what creates trans women, but what creates the conditions in which transition is possible. And so this is a larger shift I'm like following through out of this book into my current work. Like the term trans or transgender is like an identity category. It's a subjective category. And actually is like really bad at answering why questions. And so like, I'm not actually sure what we always want to know. I mean, I actually just don't think a good question is like, why are people trans? Like you'll never know the answer. There's no single answer. An interesting question is, how do people transition? Right? If you're a trans woman, you have to figure out in the place and time you live, how to become a woman socially in the world. It's actually not really a private identity. That's like a very middle-class way of thinking about it. Most people didn't think that way historically. Most people probably still don't really think that way. Like, it's a really practical question, right? I was raised as a boy. I want to be a woman. What do I do? And that's where I found the answer to why trans women do sex work. It turns out, it's like, if you live in a society, right, say the UK or the US in this example, the places I know the most about, and it's like, the 19th century or even the 20th century, and you've been told and raised that you're, to be a boy from birth, and you want to become a woman, that is a huge loss of social status, right? Women have less rights, well, up till recently, right? Women can't work in almost any industries, right? Women are seen as dependents, right? I mean, in the United States, like men can vote, women can't vote until the 19th Amendment. So it's like becoming a woman, it's actually a really profound decline in your standard of living. And so to become a woman, right, specifically transition to life as a woman, is a really primarily a practical problem. How do you do it, right? And this is well before the era when that means try to get on estrogen, right, and save up for surgery. So like, what is gender in the 19th century? Clothes, legal social status, work, right? And so it's like, oh, interesting, right? If you're transitioning to become a man in the 19th century, there's this long history of passing women. Some of them were trans men, right? Not all of them, but it's like, yeah, their work opportunities went up. They could vote. They could get married. They could own property, right? Their lives are getting easier by transitioning, right? That doesn't necessarily mean that's why they transition, but that shapes their experience. Trans women have the exact opposite experience. And so they tend to basically be completely locked out of the formal labor market, either because women can't work in many sectors of the economy, right? Or because, frankly, there's no intermediary category of male femininity in US and British society. There is a category of female masculinity. Think about tomboys, right? Think about more butch lesbians. Think about women who are totally heterosexual, but are understood to be kind of masculine, either because they're politicians or because they have jobs, right? There is a cultural degree of tolerance that absolutely does not exist for trans femininity. Any move away from masculinity and manhood is severely punished. So basically, you give up everything, right? And you cannot have a job, because also it's much harder for trans women to pass than for trans men, because there is not that intermediary category. You're either a man or a woman, and anything that like registers right in between is highly, highly devalued. And so it makes sense that if you become a woman, right, basically beginning with industrial modernity, right, you can't get a job, you have no way to make a living. What are you going to do? The only form of work still available is sex work. It's the minimum requirement entry-level position that feminized people and women can do. Anyone can do sex work. You just have to move to the right neighborhood, link up with some of the local, workers and learn from them. And so it actually just makes a lot of sense that trans women would be pushed by macroeconomic and social structures towards this form of remuneration that can, both pay for them, but also here's where it's really interesting. And if we're not being moralizing, we can learn a lot. It's a great way to become a woman. It turns out, because, what are sex workers really good at? Femininity, right? They're really good at being women, so much so that they could have men pay them huge amounts of money for the privilege of experiencing that for a few hours, right? And just historically, this is really interesting. This is what I write about in the book. You go back to actually the early 19th century, right? And actually both in England and in the United States. And it turns out very often, sex work and theater were the ways that trans women would transition. And if that sounds sort of random, why did I say theater, right? Just think about this for 1 second, right? Imagine it's 1835, okay? You're a woman, whatever that means. But like, you can't order clothes on the internet, right? You can't order women's clothes. You can't, there aren't the department stores to go into and be like, I'm shopping for my girlfriend. She's the same height as me. Right? Like, how do you become a woman? You need the clothes, right? How do you get the mannerisms? You can't pick up a copy of Good Housekeeping. It doesn't exist yet, right? So actually, acting on the stage, which is a place where effeminate males are already known to circulate, right, is like one place where you might find some tolerance for literally cross-dressing on stage because men are playing women's roles. But literally, you'll get women's clothes. You'll get to dress up. You'll get to learn makeup. You'll get to learn how to pass on stage. So you literally get access to the material things you need to become a woman socially. You can test it out in a safe environment because it's your job. And then, and here's really where it's just like, I love history. The question becomes, how do I take this character I've played on stage out the door into the street? How do I actually live as this woman? Well, it turns out sex work is the answer, because I talk about New York City in the book as the example, but New York City's theaters in the antebellum era before the Civil War modeled on London's theaters, very, very specifically. And the top row, the highest balcony in the theater, right, in the 18th and 19th century, is reserved for sex workers. Like, the theater is a place men go to meet sex workers. They go on dates with sex workers. It's not a secret. It's totally tolerated. It's an open secret. There are whole newspapers that tell you like how to go to a theater and hire a woman for the night. So if you're a trans woman, who has gotten a job as an actress, right, has been performing on stage, and you want to take that out into the world and live as a woman, all you have to do is walk up to the third balcony and meet other women sex workers, get into the trade, and then you can exit that door with a man who's giving you a new source of income, and boom, now you're a woman in public. Like, there it is. There it is, folks. Like, that's how all but the wealthiest trans women transitioned in the 19th century. And well into the 20th century, sex work remained because, like, generations of trans women handed down this knowledge, right? And it changed over time. But, like, boom, all of a sudden we know why. Why do trans women typically do sex work? Because transitioning causes such a huge downward mobility. It's one of the only forms of labor still available because it doesn't require any documents, right? And because you can also then learn how to be a woman, how to be feminine. You can come into a social community of mutual aid and support. You can, basically form tight-knit groups that will help protect you from violence in the world through doing sex work. Like, there's the answer, right? It's not a moral answer. It's an empirical answer. But I think, one, that's so interesting. Like, I just think it's fascinating. Two, it teaches us how to respect sex workers a little bit more. Like, among the many amazing things sex workers do for everyone in the world, they provide ways to become beautiful women. And I just think that's incredible. Like, that's a wonderful thing, right? Such incredible women that men are lining up to pay them. Like, I think we ought to take some note of that.
We're hopefully going to come back to the maybe femino-pessimism, if I can call it that, of modern turfism, certainly, and also some other shades of modern feminism, or modern kind of thinking about women from all sides of the political spectrum, because I think that would, for me, entertainingly and fabulously outrage people. But I really want to dig into particularly that that kind of affirmation of the kind of sex worker modality of femininity. Fantastic. First of all, I want to hear a little bit more from you, if that's all right, about Mary Jones, this figure who you pick up on, whose story I think helps us think through how race, in particular blackness, affects the conditions under which you practice gender, under which people were sort of obliged to think about the gender, and particularly the malleability of it.
Yes, I'm so glad you asked about that, because that story I just told about, like, the actress who becomes a sex worker and walks out with a gentleman into her happy life, that's a white lady story. So, like, hey, it happened. White ladies have history too. White trans women have history too. But actually, like, talking about the experience of Black trans women in particular, I think is just really revealing of how complex all of this is, and really, I think, sort of challenges us politically. So Mary Jones is an antebellum Black trans woman who was born in New York City and is famous because she was arrested, all the way in the antebellum era. And basically was put on trial for stealing the wallet of a white man. So, not exactly arrested for sex work, because sex work was not illegal. But, she was arrested. And in the course of her arrest, the officer is like, wait, this person has a male body? Wait, what? There's this little press item, and Mary Jones, very well known to historians, because she actually became kind of the object of a satire in antebellum U.S. politics. So in the lead up to the Civil War, especially in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, you have so much white supremacist moral panic around what white supremacists and abolitionists called miscegenation, right? The idea that the emancipation of enslaved, Africans and African Americans would lead to a kind of race suicide, because it would, legal equality would, encourage sex across the color line. And so in places like New York that had very slowly, but actually had abolished slavery, by the end of the 1820s, you have a lot of white supremacist basically satire and moral panic, like all the kinds of like post-truth bad journalism were like really, suffering the consequences of today. It's like, oh yeah, you go look at the antebellum version of that too. It's like very, I don't know, makes your skin crawl. But Mary Jones was really held up as proof that, like, this is why we can't abolish slavery, because legal and social equality between Black and white Americans will lead to this kind of decadence where you have Black women selling sex to white men. And the fact that Mary Jones was trans is sort of like icing on the cake to that story. It's actually not really the primary reason the press fixate on her, but it just sort of adds fuel to their fire. They're like, they're basically like, if you abolish slavery, this is the society we will have, right? So it's like Mary Jones is really well known to historians of 19th century New York, but it's like she's this really interesting person because she only exists as a satire. She exists as sort of the lampooning of a white supremacist political project. And it's like, but we know more about her than almost any other antebellum Black trans woman. And we know she's a trans woman because literally in court, they're like, so why do you dress as a woman? And she's like, oh, well, she tells this like hilarious story. That's definitely just like what trans women say when people ask them. She's like, well, I was just working at this brothel. And one day, like the girls were like, oh, you should put on a dress. And I did. And they're like, oh my God, you look so pretty. You should wear it forever. And I totally did. Like that part's obviously a joke because like trans women have been saying that for a long time. But then she sincerely says under oath, and it gets recorded in her court case, that she, quote, had always dressed this way among her own people. And she was a free Black woman in New York City, which had a huge free Black population. But she also said, and in New Orleans, I always dressed that way. And, there's plenty of scholars who have mentioned Mary Jones in passing, and she's kind of, the artist Tourmaline, amazing artist, has made a lot of art about her recently. Like Mary Jones is a name that comes up a lot. You'll see infographics like during Black History Month about Mary Jones, as part of Black women's history. But I was really interested in this question of, wait, why did she mention New Orleans? Like, why did they write that down? The court record for this trial in 1836 is very short. So I was like, what are they doing? Like, what was she saying when she wanted to make clear that she always dressed as a woman amongst other Black people, right? And in New Orleans. New Orleans is in the southern United States. It's in Louisiana, which is a state that still has legal slavery at this point. She lives in New York, right? Which is like sort of in the industrial north. And I was like, oh my God. So this free Black woman and sex worker, like in the 1820s and 30s, was traveling to New Orleans? How? Like, how did she do? I basically was just like, I want to know. I want to know more about her as a person. And I wanted to kind of take seriously the fact that like we can't make up a history for her, right? We still have to go based on what's in the record. But like, what do we do with the fact that there were like Black trans women doing sex work, transitioning this far back in time? And like, how did that work for her, right? Because traveling as a free Black woman into states with legal slavery is very dangerous, right? Not an easy thing to do. You could risk being arrested or enslaved, right? And so I basically wanted to tell this story about her life as a way to think about, the modernity of transition and the modernity of gender, right? As like a thing that we tend, I think, to think that like transitioning and like becoming your true self is like this liberating process where you sort of like release, your inner truth and like you become happier and you like, you move into harmony in the world. And of course, we know that that's like not necessarily the case, but if you really take seriously questions of mobility and embodiment and appearance, right? And you go back to this era where race and anti-Blackness is as determinant, right, of gender as anything else, then I think you get a really complicated question, right, about what does it mean for a person who's a free Black woman to be able to transition, right? Because if Mary Jones had been enslaved, she wouldn't have been able to do that. But also, like, what's going on in this time period in U.S. history, that sort of makes her life possible. And so, for me, she's this really incredible, like, in her own life, because she traveled between sort of the capital of the industrial North, New York City, and the capital of the, slavery-based economy in the South, New Orleans. She like is this person who traverses, right? And I think she provides us with this sort of really complicated case study in how we can't like romanticize basically gender as an axis of self-determination, because in fact, there are other things that determine gender relations sometimes for whole groups of people, like race and a system of racial slavery. And also Jones is living at this key historical period where a slavery-based economy is giving way to a modern capitalist economy, but it's like actually a slow and symbiotic process. We don't have a fully capitalist economy, but she's living in a time period where people are starting to work for wages more regularly for the first time. But actually, wage labor is not the only way to live in the world. And so as a sex worker, I just want to sort of date, right, Black trans women sex workers to like the opening scenes of modern industrial capitalism, right? And sort of see them there, both like to say they were there, they were part of these like systems, right? They weren't exterior to them. They didn't just emerge later. They're not just identities, right? They're not just modern identities or sensibilities, but also to say, right, if we look at that moment before the capitalist system we have today has fully come into existence, we could see just how tricky it was, right? It's not like the arrival of capitalism, like, gave Mary Jones freedom, right? No one would think she, like, basically the kind of freedom she had, right, to transition, to be a woman, to be able to travel successfully to New Orleans and back, to make a living off sex work, is tied inexorably to her being arrested and sent to prison so many times. It appears in the paper as a joke well into the 1850s. Oh, Mary Jones got arrested again. She's going upstate to a men's prison again. And so we're seeing the emergence of both, like, basically what capitalist freedom looks like, that you suddenly, because of the way the world is organized, have all this mobility if you live in a city and, work for your own money, that you can live a lifestyle that your prior generations could never have lived. But that's tied to being policed and incarcerated for Black trans women. That is the defining, structuring contradiction of Black trans women's lives that does not affect white trans women to the same degree. And part of all I wanted to raise in writing about her is to say it's been 200 years, and this is still the dominant life experience for so many Black trans women, being heavily policed and incarcerated, and also central to sex work systems, and also still the subject of media speculation, right? And everyone being like involved in their business, right? It's like, that's a remarkably durable form. And if Black trans women's living conditions have not really improved dramatically in 200 years, that's a pretty damning indictment of the kind of capitalist society and also racist society, that came out of the United States during this time period. So I could go on forever, but I shouldn't. It's there in the book if people want to read on.
It's a top tip. Do read the book. So we're very used to forms of discourse, also forms of kind of legal practice, NGO declarations, that kind of thing, that draw a very hard and fast line between sex and gender. Your histories that you uncover, the histories that you discuss, unveil something that's, I guess, much messier, right? Much more entangled, much more complicated. And you think through the dichotomy between street queens and drag queens in mid-century North America, and how they help us think through the differences between people of different class backgrounds, different racial backgrounds, and how they interact with trans femininity. Can you tell us about those street queens and drag queens whose stories you unearth?
Yeah, would be delighted to. Sometimes I think of myself as like the person who comes to town to be like, hey, you were taught at Trans 101 that this is the number one assumption you have to promote. Guess what? It's a bad assumption and we don't have to do it. And actually the distinction between sex and gender is one of them, right? I think the sort of popular party line and the way it's like both on the internet or taught at a literal Trans 101, or maybe even taught in like a college course or university course, is like, the distinction between sex and gender is this feminist triumph, right? Or this queer triumph, or this trans triumph, because it says that gender is cultural and it can be anything you want and your body has nothing to do with it, right? You can just like be any gender you want. It's amazing. Everyone has all the right? It's like, well, the sex gender distinction was invented by conservative psychologists in the 1950s to discipline and force people to align their body and their gender presentation to satisfy social norms or to avoid being like institutionalized or arrested. So actually was not invented by feminists. Feminists picked it up later. To my mind, it's a very bad politics because it can just be weaponized against you instantly. I mean, like, we'll talk more about TERFs in a bit, but so I just don't like the sex gender distinction. But one thing I want to say about it is it's a class distinction. The belief that sex and gender are separate correlates very strongly to a college degree and to middle class people. It is a middle class way of thinking. because you cultivate, if you have middle class education and you're like acculturated in middle class sort of taste making circles, you spend a lot of time thinking about yourself, cultivating a kind of, private interior self. You tend to really sort of lean in on gender, right? You tend to think words are really important, right? Whether you wear nail polish or not says a lot about you, right? These are just things, these are middle-class habits that sociologists have studied for decades. But we talk about this like it's a universal truth that sex and gender are different. Well, turns out in the working classes, that has just absolutely not been the case. No one would have ratified that distinction, like historically. And I'm still not even convinced people actually live this way in the real world. And think about how important this is for the history of trans femininity, because one of the biggest libels against trans women is a sexual libel, that they are really men, which is to say that they are driven by some sort of male sexual perversion, that they're sexual aggressors, that they're perverts and deviants. And this is often just homophobic, right? And I think that makes people uncomfortable, but also people don't know what to do with it. Oh, it's bad. It's bad to be homophobic to trans women because they're not gay men. It's like, is that really the clapback that we need here, right? Like, what's going on? Why are we not taking this on more centrally? Because historically, right, for this class of trans women, which is the majority of them who tend to do sex work, right, actually, like, their sexuality is really important to who they are. It's part of their livelihood. It's part of how they're valued by not just by men, but it's often how they value themselves. And one of the interesting things I don't think people realize is when the word transgender was sort of, on its meteoric rise in the 1990s into the term we use today, it was really kind of, basically promoted by, NGOs, social service organizations, HIV, outreach orgs, sex work orgs, and it was adopted by state bureaucracies and things like that. It's really an administrative word used to win grants, right? Used to justify spending on healthcare in cities. And basically the word transgender was really in the 90s being used to say these poor trans women who do sex work are not like gay men.
Right.
The problem with that was when all these people would go out onto the street and say, hello, you're a transgender woman, right? You're not gay. They'd be like, what are you talking about? I'm a woman and I'm gay. Or they'd be like, I'm gay. What are you talking about? Yeah, I'm a girl, but I'm gay. Like, we actually just steamrolled this entire class of people because they were poor and we didn't take what they said seriously. And we actually cast it as backwards or inappropriate or out of date because, frankly, middle-class gay politics didn't want to have anything to do with these girls. And it really serves the interests of like LGBT liberals or, gay liberals, right, to have nothing to do with poor trans women. So the sex gender distinction and the distinction between sexuality and gender identity, these are very bourgeois things that we invented basically to discipline trans women, poor trans women, right? So I just think, like, first of all, if you note where it comes from and its actual political purposes, I just don't think most people will love it anymore. So I just always want to draw that to everyone's attention because there's no reason for anyone to know any of this, right?
Right.
Just no one knows anything about trans people. It's totally fine. I'm here to tell you. But then there's this really amazing history that I write about in the third chapter of the book that I do want people to know and I do want us to think about. And, it's sort of this ridiculous situation we live in now where the way we talk about the difference between trans women and gay men just does not accord with reality at all. I mean, we're just lying to ourselves. So we're like, gay men and trans women, practically a different species, right? Don't confuse them. If you go to a workshop or an online training, it's the first thing people are going to tell you. A trans woman is not a gay man and a gay man is not a woman. Don't you ever make that conflation. Okay, well, a lot of trans women did live as gay men in the world. It didn't mean they were gay men, but why do you disappear that entire part of their lives? For me, this was personal. I was like, I lived as a gay boy for many years because it's so hard to transition and live as a woman in the world. Every incentive was against me doing it, that this was a pathway into something that felt a little bit better. And I don't regret that. I appreciate gay male culture so much because it gave me permission to be different. I was socialized in gay culture, right? I had an introduction to a wonderful sex life, right? And now I'm a woman. And guess what, honey? That happens a lot. So it's why do we don't want to talk about this, but I think we should. And one reason I think we should is because historically, this class system in the gay world, is actually really centered around these precise people, the people who were called queens back in the day. People now today, queen is like a term on Drag Race, right? Or like, it's like, like your therapist might say, yes, queen or something, right? It's like, okay, where did that term come from? The queen is a really important figure, is this sort of poor trans feminine person. The street queen, right, is basically this person, who the word transgender is trying to disappear in the 90s. This group of people were really central to gay life, to working class gay life in large cities, pretty far back, but I focus on the 1960s, really the sort of peak of this moment, where the street queen, the kind of person who is quote unquote in drag in public, right? And probably wants to transition, but just there's no way in the world that's going to happen because of poverty and criminalization. This person was revered and important in the gay world, also devalued and looked down upon because she represented this sort of paradox. Like no one could have fallen further than someone who would dare to break the law and wear drag in public. Someone who's doing sex work, someone who dreams of turning into a beautiful female woman one day, despite living in abject poverty. I mean, it was really a symbol of how far you could fall in the gay world, but it was also a symbol of the exalted power of giving up all the social and moral opprobriums in the world and saying, fuck you. I'm gonna get what I deserve. And so actually, like, these queens are central to gay male culture. Like, they're all over the literature. Like, they really were people in the world. They were revered. They were followed around. Gay men were fascinated by them, whether they were effeminate or butch or not, right? It's like these people had real currency. And they're also the people that we say we want to celebrate, the ones who led the Stonewall Rebellion. These people are Sylvia Rivera. They are Marsha P. Johnson. They are people who often led the most combative, militant, and effective uprisings against the police and against state power. These are not the people who would picket, the American Psychiatric Association. These are people who would, punch cops in the face, right? And so they led the emergence of the modern LGBT movement, but they were quickly disavowed in the early 1970s by middle-class gay and lesbian people who were like, actually, you're too disreputable, and I think I got a good thing going here. If I'm just kind of a regular guy or woman who happens to be gay, we've all heard that phrase before. Oh, I just happen to be gay. It's a really private part of my life. Well, then actually I might get civil rights because otherwise I'm like a white guy. I'm going to college, right? I actually talk about this in the book. In New York City, it's like you have the Stonewall Rebellion. You have Sylvia and Marsha and their group of transvestites, transsexuals, street queens, right, who are allied with gay and lesbian people. But a lot of those people go to NYU, to New York University, and they're like, I don't know, I'm getting a degree. I have a good career coming. I'm a normal guy or girl. I really don't want to fight the police. And they break off from them in the early 70s and disavow the street queen. And basically, I tell this story very dramatically because, queens deserve drama through this novel, City of Night, a wonderful novel written by John Recchi, where there's this actual, there's a street queen character based on a real person who's quoting Shakespeare. There's this dramatic rise and fall. And it's this beautiful story about like tragedy and redemption. And I kind of just wanted to talk about how we totally threw away this category of person, the street queen, who had a lot to tell us about what politics that would lift everyone up could look like, starting from the bottom, right? Throwing away our internalized shame and stigmas, demanding the most from the world, and not fretting over the difference between gay men and trans women. And we deliberately threw that away to emphasize a sex-gender distinction, to forward an assimilationist, middle-class LGBT politics. And all I want to say is, look where that got us. There's more political homophobia today than there was in the 1970s. Like, just quantitatively, I mean, there's more people and more politicians. Like, we are not in a much better situation. There are a lot more civil rights for middle-class gay people. Middle-class gay people in the United States, for example, actually don't really suffer any financial penalties anymore for being gay. Yeah, good for them. But like, is that stopping right-wing politicians from wanting to recriminalize sodomy? No. Right? Is gay marriage even guaranteed to last in the United States? Absolutely not. Never mind the political transphobia going on. So I'm just like, we gave up the really interesting politics and power and the passion of the street queen, this person who promised to deliver us to a better world, because if she could make her dream come true and become the beautiful woman that she knew she was, it would take a whole different material world. It would take a world without police. It would take a world with free healthcare on demand. It would take a world that recognized and celebrated femininity and didn't devalue it. It would take a world that didn't indulge in homophobia and didn't demand respectability politics to accept gender and sexual minorities. It would be a totally different feminism that included everyone and led with sex workers, right? I mean, we gave that up and it didn't work. That's my thesis, right? We gave this up 50 years ago. The returns are abysmal. I think we should go back. I think we should reinvest in queens. And guess what? They're still out there. We still got queens. They didn't disappear. They've just been completely pushed out of the narrative and marginalized, or frankly, just sort of caricatured and turned into weird cartoon versions of who they really were. And so I just try to tell this story in the book about this working class street queen, what her life was like in the 60s, what she represented, the power that she wielded symbolically was so big that the gay movement aggressively suppressed her right after it was formed. And then everything has just been kind of terrible ever since. I don't know. I think there's a lesson there. That's me being editorial, right? Like I leave it to readers to take away what they want to take away. But I just think that's our history.
So let's look at where that history got us then. So let's roll forward to the present day and take a little sniff around at what is, universally recognizable as a pretty terrible situation for trans and gender non-conforming people everywhere, for queens everywhere. You think about, or you prescribe a politics of mujerismo. I'm definitely pronouncing that wrong. Please correct me. But it's the translation of Latin American, Central American feminist phrase for the most femininity, right? And I'm really intrigued by it as a kind of counterpoint to, certainly what I was sort of notionally brought up on as a bedrock of feminism, ambiently in the culture, I should say, which was, feminism was kind of trading on an equality that meant denying femininity, or kind of getting on board with the idea that there was something suspicious or weak or lesser than in the feminine. And today we see in strains of turfism a suspicion of the feminine, or the kind of womanhood as a mode of being, as this sort of this mode of suffering, and look at how we bleed and look at how we labor for men, and which does obviously leave me wondering, like, okay, why are we so invested in protecting this category if it's so terrible? Tell me what is kind of appealing, what's urgent, what's important for you in the sort of a politics of reaffirming the feminine.
Yeah, I think this is the part that I still feel so excited about, because it's sort of like taken me a while to be kind of courageous enough to embrace this, both in my thinking and for myself, which is, right, I'm right. This book is sort of a loose global history, and I don't mean that as in it's comprehensive. I mean, I'm thinking about transnational dynamics, historically, world systems like colonialism and capitalism, and the legacy of empire. And so, I'm also writing about the imperialism of Anglo-American culture. And certainly when it comes to trans history, trans politics, dominant concepts of what transgender is, Anglo-American and Western European, reference points have been projected onto the entire globe. And yeah, it's like, okay, Anglo-American culture in particular, the Protestant history of political action, and including feminism, has been intensely anti-feminine. I mean, it's like for women to accrue power and to accrue equality under equality feminism, they had to implicitly or explicitly, it often was explicit, but it's at least implicit, have to defeminize themselves to become more like the men who currently enjoy as a class disproportionate power. And, it's like there are only 1 million examples of this, but the easiest one is just think of women leaders, right? Of course, Margaret Thatcher is one of the classic examples, but you can think of, Theresa May or whomever. How intensely is women's appearance and demeanor in politics policed? They have to appear less feminine to be taken seriously as powerful. And yet, if they become too masculine, they get called lesbians, or they get, it's like, it's an impossible bind. But the whole point is that femininity is the suspect attribute. It's weakness. It's the antithesis of power, right? It's vulnerability. But women in general are generally pressured to become equal by defeminizing themselves. Now, of course, like, some of the feminine constraints of the past were pretty shitty, right? Like getting to wear pants, that was a big win. But I think part of what's happened is that we underestimate the extent to which feminist modes of political organizing are premised on the erasure of femininity. And that's something that also just is misogynistic, right? It's feminist misogyny. Feminists can be misogynist too. But it also is characteristic of homophobia, where effeminacy is the most devalued characteristic, particularly of gay men, and of trans misogyny, where it's the femininity of trans women that is singled out as the object of concern and the threat to be put down. So I'm just like, wait a minute. Here's our grounds for solidarity. Femininity, that's the thing policed in everyone. So in that larger context, if Anglo-American Protestant culture and feminism is particularly kind of like hates femininity and pretty masculinizing, in fact, I want to look to other places in the world since I've done this transnational history. And Latin America has this really rich tradition. Latin America has this really, rich cultural tradition that is not a monolith, that's like incredibly complex and detailed and regionally variable, but of travestis, people who are also not trans women, right? There are also trans women in Latin America, but travestis, are people who tend to be working class, tend to be sex workers, tend to absolutely not give a shit about the distinction between sex or gender, or actually get really angry if you try to enforce that on them, tend to be very happy with their relationship to gay culture, right? And tend to transition differently than trans women. There are just different kinds of things they desire sometimes for their bodies, have a really different kind of politics, have historically, but also tend to be the kinds of trans feminized populations that I've been talking about in this whole conversation, people who are heavily policed and criminalized, subject to a lot of state violence, and by consequence, a lot of interpersonal violence, and really live economically pretty disenfranchised as well as politically. Well, also tend to be cultural tastemakers, tend to be, really quite influential, locally. And one of the kind of terms that circulates both in Spanish and in Portuguese throughout Latin America in very different inflections in different locations is this term, in Spanish at least, mujerísima. And the ísima, right, is sort of like the most of something. And mujer, or in Portuguese, mulher, is just woman. So you could think of this as a kind of bad translation. This is a bad translation, but it's good for our purposes of mujerísima is like the quality of being the most woman. It's the superlative, right? And it's a phrase that comes up, in relation to travestis or is spoken by travestis, often to describe the fact they're like, well, I'm not. The issue at hand in my life is not that I'm trying to blend in and just be a regular woman. Oh no, honey, I have more than most women, and I'm proud of that. That's where my value comes from. I'm not trying, right? And I don't just mean like, are they trying to pass or no? It's like it's this like quality of like I'm not afraid of embracing femininity to the maximum because I have experienced the exalted delights, and there is a certain freedom in going so deep through the stigmatized category that you come out on the other end, basically, cultivated it to an extent that no one else would dare in the world. And there's no romance about it. Travestis are subject to high rates of sexual violence, police violence, interpersonal violence, and state violence. But that's the whole point. They're like, we need to, get rid of those modes of violence so that this kind of exalted superlative femininity could, flourish in the world. And so I basically just take that as a meditation and a provocation. It's not a program. I'm not saying that anyone should become like travestis. Absolutely not. I'm not making an argument for cultural appropriation. I'm not even telling people to become more feminine. I'm just saying, think about this. We live in such a terrible scarcity mindset around gender. Like, there's not enough gender to go around. That's like the TERF sort of grievance politics, right? I'm under threat. I have to have all the womanhood. You can't have any of it, right? Terrible scarcity mindset around femininity. Like, femininity is just bad, and we shouldn't actually, probably an ideal world wouldn't have any of it. This goes straight back to 70s lesbian feminism, where it was like unisex clothes is more important. And when you have sex, it should be very gentle. Don't ever get too into it. We need a world that's just like doesn't indulge, is very plain, very contractual, right? Where everything is just about like, knowing everything in advance and having strong rules, right? And that culture has become very popular, not just among TERFs. I actually think it's quite central to middle-class queer and trans culture amongst white college-educated people today. And so I simply want to say, this is a losing game. Why are you sacrificing all the things that make life good? And also, how dare you pin all of that on trans feminized people, right? Stop coming for my queens. Don't you dare come for travestis, right? For being the most. It's you. It's all of us, really, who are afraid of what it would mean to embrace creating a world in which being too much was okay. There are basically no feminist projects except like what used to be called third world feminist projects, or in this case, travesti feminist projects, trans feminist projects in Latin America that promise a world like that, right? And I just think there's a lot that Anglo-American culture, with its absolute love of self-flagellation and throwing away all joy and happiness just out of fear or just like being addicted to our own misery. There's so much we could learn from that kind of surplus economy of being willing to demand the most. The one thing I have learned from writing this book is that it is the trans feminized people, the trans women, the street queens, the travestis, the sex workers, the people who have, been made to do it the least in the world, who have learned to demand the most because, frankly, they've been pushed into that position, but they have demonstrated both the courage and the passion to demand more. And I just think for the rest of us, I include myself here as a boring professor, we got a lot to learn. We have a lot to learn from those people. We need to, be in solidarity with them politically first, but we also need to go through a kind of a political apprenticeship to learn how to want more and to ask for more. And the third best time is tomorrow, and so on and so forth. We haven't lost the opportunity to demand a better world, but I think if we want to demand a world collectively, we're just going to have to figure out how to break our scarcity mindset and our austerity mindset, and it's like, who's the most austerity-pilled people in the world, in my opinion? Americans and Britons. So, I think we have a lot to learn from other people in the world. We have to really challenge ourselves to learn to genuinely want more and not rationalize our suffering any longer. And I just happen to think that Mujerísima is one wonderful way to start that for a materialist feminist politics and a transnational politics of solidarity.
The dolls holding all the receipts, holding the present, holding the future. Jules, thank you so much for coming on to talk with us. It's been a pleasure chatting with you.
Oh, it's been an absolute joy. Thank you for letting me ramble about the girls.
A pleasure. Support independent journalism and set up a regular donation to Novara Media from just £1 a month. Head to novara.media/support.